Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining me on another episode of Learning from Leaders. And on this episode, I want to talk about resilience. And I think how important that is right now. I will tell you, of all the work that I do, not to bring up COVID again, but I will say that certainly since COVID, I have found that people's ability to become resilient, to overcome challenges that they're faced with, just seems to be more difficult. And what I want to do is provide, I think, a little bit of background in terms of some of the things that we know from a standpoint of research can help in regards to resilience. And I want to talk about a model that I've created called Power that I use. That there's an opportunity to download a journal, a free journal that you can use. And again, it's just based on some of the research that I had come across in terms of activities. What are the things that we can do to improve our resilience, strengthen our resilience, really, in whatever aspect that we're in? And before we do that, though, I want to talk about a few things that I think are very important as it relates to building resilience. And the first thing that I want to talk about is around mindset. And mindset is everything. And Carol Dweck is probably the one that's most recognized for this area in terms of mindset, where she talks about growth versus fixed mindset. And really, all fixed mindset, it's our ability to, when we have a fixed mindset, is to think that things are out of our control, that it's just the way it is. We have no control. Whereas a growth mindset really is all about, we believe that we have the ability to change whatever it is that is going on. And if you think about it from the standpoint of challenges, things we're faced with, if I have a fixed mindset, then it's easy for me not to have a lot of resilience because I don't think I have any control over what's happening. And I think it can lead us down a path of depression and anxiety. Whereas if I have a growth mindset or develop a growth mindset, which we know we can do, then I approach things differently. And this isn't to say that it's a Pollyanna, that no problems exist when I have a growth mindset. It's just how we show up to those problems, which is really all that we can control. The next part of this that I want to talk about is around grit. And that's work that's been done by Angela Duckworth. She's probably the most well-recognized in terms of that space, in terms of grit. And really, all grit is this ability for us to, again, deal with the challenges that we're faced with. And we find a way to muscle through those things. And to me, it's almost an extension of a growth mindset. When we have grit, we're just not going to be denied. We find a way to muscle through on things. Now, along those lines, I also wanted to talk about some research that was done many years ago, 1968 to be exact. And it was a study that was done by a researcher named George Land. And it's based on some work that he was doing with NASA. And NASA had approached him to say, look, we need some type of assessment that will help us identify high potentials or people that are really creative. So he created this assessment. What he then did was modified this and used it again with 3 to 5 year olds, about 1,600 3 to 5 year olds. He was amazed at what he found was that based on this assessment, when he did this with 3 to 5 year olds, almost 98% of them were considered highly creative. And he, again, was astounded by this. What he then did was he created a longitudinal study from this, where he followed these kids, as many as he could, out till when they were 10 years old, and then at 15, reassess them again. What's interesting is by the time these kids were 10, that only 30% of them still identified as highly creative. And when they went out to 15 years old, it was only about 12%. What's even more fascinating about this is that there were about 280,000 adults that also took this assessment, and only 2% were identified as highly creative. Now, what happens when we turn 5? We go to school. And this isn't to say that school sucks it out of us, but in some ways it does. And what it talked about was, in terms of creativity, that we have what's called divergent versus convergent thinking. And when we have convergent thinking, it's really very much, if we think about, there's really only one solution or a limited number of solutions, whereas divergent thinking is all about really endless opportunities. And I would say that to me, it's very much like growth versus fixed mindset in that situation. Think about it in terms of two things. One is convergent thinking. There's only so many solutions here, or maybe only one solution that we're going to look at. To me, that would be like dumping a puzzle out. And there's only one way to put this puzzle together. Whereas divergent thinking really is about dumping a box of Legos out on the table and saying, you decide, figure out what you want to develop. So, not to put all the rap on school, I do think that this happens in our environments too. Think of growing up. You start to talk about things that you want to be, who you want to be when you grow up. And we might have people around us that say, oh, you can't do that. Come on, let's be realistic here. It gets sucked out of us. And by some well intentioned individuals, but there's this idea of a lack of creativity, right? Convergent thinking. There are only so many things that you can do. And I think this impacts our ability to be resilient when we're not creative. So the last part I want to speak about before we go into the power journal, and I'll talk about those 5 exercises or activities that you can do, is around what's called the thought record. And the thought record is something that's used in cognitive behavioral therapy. And I will tell you, I think it's one of the most valuable tools that I think that we can use in terms of helping us when we might be catastrophizing on things, or we think like this, things are never going to get better. It's always going to be difficult for me, whatever those things are. The thought record is an activity that we can do where we start out by asking ourselves and writing it down. What is the evidence that supports and what is the evidence that would negate that what I'm thinking right now is accurate? So we start from there. And what we're doing here when we start that is we're starting to slow down our thinking to actually be able to not be reactionary, but to respond more, right? So the next thing that we can ask ourselves is, what's the best, worst, and most realistic outcome? And if you think about that, how many times have we gone to the worst case scenario? We think, oh, this is terrible. And we think back something that happened a year ago or 2 years ago. We thought this was the end. And we look back on it now and we realize that it wasn't the end. We're still here. We survived. And again, I think that's the important thing as we start to slow this down. First, we're doing what's the evidence that backs up that this could be true, that it's not true? And then the next thing that we ask ourselves, if it is true, what's the worst, best, and most realistic outcome? And oftentimes it again allows us to balance ourselves more. So the next thing, could I live through it? If you think about all the challenges that we've been through so far, if we're still here, we're batting 100%, that we are able to make it through all of these things that seem so difficult in life. So the next thing is we ask ourselves is, what's the bigger picture, right? There's more to this generally. And I think when we become stressed or anxious on things, we fixate and our lens gets smaller in terms of what we look at. So this is an opportunity to say, what else is out there? What's really the big picture here? Next question I would ask myself is, am I thinking in all or nothing terms? Again, slowing things down. And the next question I'm going to ask is, what could I do to solve this problem? So if you think about that, we're already down 5 questions that we've asked ourselves or ticked off before we've even gotten to the question of, what are we going to be able to do to solve this? And that's intentional, because when we slow this down and start to think more objectively about what's going on, our mind then is able to be more creative in regards to how we're going to solve this problem. And the last question that you can ask yourself is, what difference is this going to make in 2 weeks, in 2 years, in 10 years? And oftentimes what we start to realize is that this is not that big of a deal. Not to say that it's not something that's important, but it allows us to, I think, breathe and be able to deal with this in a much more effective way. So what have we talked about? Mindset, right? Growth versus fixed. We talked about the importance of grit. We talked about the NASA study looking at convergent versus divergent thinking. And then this piece, the thought record. Now, what I want to talk about is this journal that, again, you can download for free. It's based on 5 activities that we're going to talk about that all have research that support why they're important. And I will tell you for myself, this is something that I do on an almost daily basis. I do all of these things, or at least make an attempt to, or go in with the intention of trying to do these. So it's called the Power Journal because it's an acronym for these 5 activities. Now, there was a researcher named Sean Aker who did what was called the 21-Day Happiness Challenge. He did something very similar to these 5 things that we're talking about back in 2008, I believe it was. And what he found was that when individuals on a regular basis did these 5 activities, that they reported themselves to be happier, not only 21 days later, but also, I believe, 6 months later, when they had to self-report again, they also reported themselves as being happier. So the first activity in Power is about praise. And this is about gratitude. Again, if you were to go on and Google the number of pieces of research that are out there in regards to the benefit that gratitude has, it's incredible. the support that's out there for when we practice gratitude, what that does for us. So every morning I start out by writing in a journal. I write down 3 things that I'm grateful for. That's my praise. And again, there's a journal that that's the first thing I do when I wake up in the morning is I write down these 3 things that I'm grateful for. And it could be anything. They don't always have to be these elaborate things that I'm grateful for. It could just be, I'm grateful for a cup of coffee that I had this morning, or for getting up this morning. I have another opportunity to make a day of it. I will say as well, what can be important here is find ways to be grateful for the things that you're challenged with. Because when we do that, when we find an opportunity to be grateful for those things that challenge us, it allows us to almost flip those things and say, I'm going to take advantage of the challenge that I'm in front of you. You're not going to get the best of me. I'm going to find a way that this is going to be something that's going to benefit me. I'm going to be grateful for it. That's the P in the power model. The O is to do something for somebody else during the day. Find an opportunity where you can do something for somebody else that has no benefit on you. And we know the research that's out there. If we look at things like volunteering, what that does for us. Oftentimes when people are stressed out or when they don't feel good about themselves, oftentimes helping somebody else out in their situation helps to lessen the stress and anxiety that we feel about our own position or where we are, because we're actually feeling somewhat in control. We're helping somebody else. So the W in the Power Journal is about writing. And this is about 2 to 3 sentences. And what I recommend is at the end of the day, write down 2 to 3 sentences about what went well during the day. And if you think about this, where did we start our day? We started it from a standpoint of being grateful, right? I'm grateful for these things. Now, what if I end my day from that same position? What am I grateful for today? What happened today that I'm grateful for? And I realize some days might be more difficult than others, where I might just be grateful for making it through the day. I survived today, and that's enough. But writing down at the end of the day what you're grateful for, I think is so important in terms of building this muscle that we start and end our day from a place of gratitude. Now, full disclosure, I'll tell you that I don't write down at the end of the day anymore what I'm grateful for. But what I do is when I get into bed, the first thing that I do before I go to sleep is I will think about those things that I am grateful for. I will ask myself the question, what is it that I'm grateful for today? So I do that exercise that is in my head, but in the morning, I always write it down. So the next piece is around exercise. Again, there's so much research that demonstrates the importance of exercise as it relates to well-being and creativity and the reduction of stress and anxiety. There are a couple studies that I will often use. One that was done several years ago, but it was done with patients that they were diagnosed with a major depressive episode. So these weren't just people that said, I don't feel really very good today. These were patients that were diagnosed as having a major depressive episode. And what they did was in this one study, they put them into 3 different groups. One group, they just had to exercise 30 minutes a day, 4 days a week. The next group, it was exercise plus an antidepressant. And then the last group was an antidepressant alone. They followed them for 4 months. And at the end of 4 months, what they found was the remission rates were almost about the same for all 3 groups. What was more interesting, though, is that when they went out 6 months and 10 months, they found that the exercise alone group actually did better than the drug and the drug plus exercise group did in terms of relapse rates. Now, this is not to say that if you're on an antidepressant that you simply work out 4 days a week for 30 minutes a day and you'll be all set. But it certainly speaks to the importance that and the impact that exercise has on us neurochemically, whether it's through dopamine or serotonin or norepinephrine, that those neurochemicals, they have an impact on us. And this doesn't have to be 30 minutes a day. You could start out with 10 minutes a day, 15 minutes a day of how valuable that could be, just taking a walk. There's actually some work or some research that I had heard Andrew Huberman from the Huberman Lab talk about, where he talked about the importance of just fidgeting, just movement in different parts of the day, how that can impact us. The last thing that we talk about in the Power Journal is about relaxation. And this isn't about becoming a yogi and I've got to learn how to meditate and quiet my mind down completely. This could be as simple as finding 2 minutes during the day for quiet time. Again, for me, I do it first thing in the morning. That's something that's part of my ritual. After I do my gratitude, I write down my intentions for the day in my journal. I have a reading, a book that I read from by Emmett Fox. And then from there, I will meditate for about 10 minutes where I just close my eyes and I try and visualize like what things I want to achieve. Where am I going? What do I want to do? And I almost see myself in those places. That's how I do it. Again, there are a number of different ways that we can do it. There's a lot of research around mindfulness and the importance of or the impact that mindfulness has on our well-being and happiness. And again, in as little as 2 minutes a day. And that's it. If we were to add up the amount of time that all five of those activities take up that I talked about in the Power Journal, it's less than an hour. You can almost think of this as like your power hour. And if you're saying, Patrick, I just don't have time to do that, I'm going to say, yes, you do. You absolutely have time. It's that you're not making the time for it. And I'm not saying you have to do an hour right out of the gate, but you could wake up 10 minutes earlier. You could wake up 5 minutes earlier and just start with the mindfulness exercise, or just take 5 minutes and think about writing three things down that you're grateful for. There is a place that you can build this muscle. And that's exactly what it is when we think of resilience, is we're building a muscle. So when it comes back to dealing with challenges, if you think about from a resilient standpoint, if I start my day out being grateful for wherever I am, that helps me to deal with the challenges that I'm faced with. If I'm doing things for other people, that makes me feel better. If I'm writing down at the end of the day what went well for the day, where's my focus again? On the positive. If I'm exercising regularly, we know that has an impact on resilience. And lastly, if I'm focused on some type of meditation or relaxation, we know the impact that has. So the Power Journal, again, free download if you want it. A couple other things that I want to revisit. One is our mindset, growth versus fixed. Find ways to be in a growth mindset. We all have resources that are limited to us, whatever it is. I'm not tall enough. I'm not smart enough. I don't have the right education, whatever those things are. We all have equal access to resourcefulness. Nobody gets any more or any less. We all have the ability to look at whatever situation we're in, which to me is the growth mindset, and to be able to find a way that we're going to overcome that. To me, that's where grit comes into play. And that's where that NASA study around divergent thinking becomes really important, is to remember we all had this in us. And for some of us, we've just been playing an album or a recording that's told us we're not good enough to do something. And that's a lie, because you can do it. I hope you found this valuable. I hope you're able to take some of these things, find ways to apply them into your day-to-day. I promise you, if you do, this is your roadmap to becoming more resilient in whatever aspect of life you're being challenged in right now. And lastly, I hope you'll go out there and find a way to rise above your best. Peace.